Okay, welcome to, well, my first video. I'm going to do a puzzle rush survival because I wanted to do something kind of instructive, and I'm going to explain my thought process as I go through each puzzle, make it more obvious what we should be looking for. And yeah, let's do this. Okay, so the first puzzle we got is a rook f2 they've played. Okay, so the first thing you usually want to look for in a puzzle is checks. And the only check that I see initially is rook to e1 check, and I think that's going to be the solution because they only then have one move. It's a forced move, and to move the rook back, and because that square is also covered by the bishop, we can just take and it's going to be checkmate. And here we have another puzzle where we're going to look for checks. Usually at the start of the puzzle rush it's checks that we're looking for, and in this case it's actually a mate in one, bishop a6, because these two squares that the king could have gone to are covered by both the bishops then, and the only other square that they can go to run away, d7, is now released and covered by the rook since the bishop moved, so that's just mate. Knight h3. Okay, this puzzle seems like there's not any checks available, so here we look for captures instead, and the only capture that I can see is the bishop. If you notice that there's actually relatively even material, so all the minor pieces are still on the board, all the knights and bishops, and the queens and the rooks for both sides. I think only one pawn's been exchanged. So really we just win a piece if we just take the bishop. So that's the solution. d5. And this one, there's no checks, it's an endgame, so you kind of have to think about it more differently. So it looks like it's going to be a pawn race. And once you get a pawn to the end, you can make a queen, and that will hopefully win the game. And I believe white is too slow here to catch the pawn if I keep running. And I'm one square ahead. Notice he just went to their 5th rank when I'm already on the 5th rank. So we just win the race. Keep going, make a queen, and yeah, that's the solution. This is also another endgame. Looks like it's going to be another race, and I believe we can just count the moves. Usually in these kind of puzzles, we can just count the moves and check how many moves it takes to see if we're quicker. So here white needs to play king takes b5, c4, c5, c6, c7, c8, and that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves. Black needs to take this pawn and play these moves. So 1, 2 has to move out the way, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And 7 moves is obviously longer than 6, and we get to move first. So we'll get the queen first and be able to keep bothering the king and stop their pawn from making a queen as well. So we just keep going, and that's the solution. Okay, here c3 has been played by white, and we look for checks. There's no checks in this position because all our pieces are really far away from the king. And so we look for captures, and the only capture I can actually see in this position is pawn takes. And notice how if we take, it's also defended by a bishop behind it, and they only have one piece, their bishop, covering that square. So technically if they take the pawn, we just take the bishop and we win the bishop for one pawn, which is just a trade of we win a piece basically. And that's the solution here. It's simply just winning a piece. Okay, so now we look for checks once again. In this case we're actually gonna create a fork, which is when you attack two pieces of high value at the same time. So here, if we play knight c4 check, we attack both the king and the rook at the same time. So knight c4, and take the rook. Simple. Okay. Here, if play rook takes f3. So notice here we're down a bishop. So what we want to do is either potentially win back the bishop, since we're up a pawn, or somehow find a way to checkmate. My initial thought was rook takes h5, which looks almost like checkmate, except that they can then take the rook on g6, so it doesn't quite work. But what we can do is rook g7 check, and if the king moves here, we bring the other rook up and it's checkmate. So they're going to have to play king h8, in which case we can just take the bishop, and we win the bishop. And I believe that's the solution. And I think we can even force a draw if we play check, they run here and we play back, because then we're threatening rook h6 checkmate. So he has to keep going back and forth and we keep going back and forth. So rook g7 is the move, and then rook takes d7. But yeah. Okay. So here, it looks like we're down material, and we are for the moment. The bishop is just been, well, yeah, it's just captured a pawn. And we're down a bishop. We only have one, they have two. Versus 2 rooks and 2 rooks. So that's a problem. So what I noticed was rook g3. Remember, checks first. Always try and check first. And it's a forcing move. So rook g3 forces king h8. And from that position, it's simple that bishop f6 is just a checkmate, and then that's it, yeah. Because from rook g3, you can look at all the possible checks. Rook g8 is a possible check, I guess, but it's just a free rook. Take with either king or the rook. So bishop f6 is the only other check in this position, and that's checkmate, actually. Okay, good. Okay, so here, this is an interesting position. We're down a knight, I believe. Yep. So we need to kind of disturb the king. Since we're down a material, we're looking to disturb the king's position. So also notice we have kind of an asset, the h6 pawn. So what we can do is we can push it and threaten to make a queen. So if I play this, check, defended by the rook. If he plays here, we just make a queen and win the game. So he's not going to play king g7 or king f7, because either way we just make a queen. And there's no immediate threats or anything going on here. It's all defended, so it's fine. So h7, king h8 is forced. And if they play that, that's not a problem, because we then have a bishop f6 check in between her. And the only way to defend then is bishop g7. And that's forced. But then from that position, we look for checks once again. If we take, it's forced, king takes. Now if we promote the pawn, it doesn't work because they have a rook and a king. So let me highlight the line from the beginning. h7 check, king h8, bishop f6 check, bishop g7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, pawn h8 now does not work because the rook and the king will be covering that square, and we only have one piece covering that square. So instead of promoting the pawn after this line, we can play queen g5 check, and that causes the king to run away from the h8 square, and so then after that we can promote the pawn. So that should be the solution. Yep, takes, and they just ended it there because it was after queen g5 was just winning. Okay, king e2. So in this position we are actually up the exchange. We're up a rook for a knight because there's 2 rooks and the 2 bishops cancel out, but they do have 2 pawns, so not really up an exchange. 2 knights, oh sorry, 2 pawns and a knight for the rook. But another problem that we have is this bishop is attacking both rooks, essentially. Because if this one moves, then they can take this one. So what we need to do is we need to get out of this threat. And I'm thinking a way to do that might be to play rook e8 check and then move the rook. Another possibility might be to take, because that's a capture. But the problem is they can just take this rook, or they just take this rook and they're just up 2 pawns. So it doesn't really do much. But I believe looking at checks first, rook e5 is a check, but the knight's covering that square, so that's not worth looking at. So I believe rook e8 is the solution to get out of this and then move this rook. And actually, now that they've played king d3, notice how after the rook check, the king had to leave the protection of the knight, which the rook was attacking, which is also attacking the king and the bishop both at the same time. So now we can check the king and then take the bishop, and then that's how we win the game, because we end up a rook up. Okay, next puzzle, g6 was the move played. Okay, so look for checks first. Bishop b5 is the only check here, and we've got to consider all the possible options they have. So if bishop blocks, that bishop was protecting the knight and is now no longer protecting the knight, and also obstructing the queen's defense of the knight, which we are attacking. So by playing bishop b5 check, if bishop d7, we can take the knight and defend the bishop at the same time, which means that bishop b5 should work. Then we consider the other option, which is queen d7, but the thing is, if you play queen d7, we just take the queen for a bishop, and that's just simply winning material. So bishop b5 is clearly the solution. queen takes d5, and then take the bishop. And there we go. Okay. Now the next one. So now in this puzzle, we're going to identify how to use pins effectively, or force into pins. So remember we looked at checks in the beginning. So rook h8 is a check, but you just sacrifice the rook for nothing, and you can play queen h5 and try and keep checking, but then queen h6 blocks it, and then the king is safe, so there's nothing really happening there. So the only other check that's viable I can see, queen f7 is a check, but obviously they've covered it on several ways. So queen h7 is the only logical check. And after queen h7, king f7, notice how the king and queen are on the same line. So we can play rook f3, creating a pin. The queen can't move because then the king would be in check, which means we just simply win the queen for the rook. And because we're rook down, we will then even up the material and get back into the game. So that is the solution. Yep, and then we just take. Okay. Now this is an interesting one. So we have quite an attacking position here. We have the knight and the queen converging on the h2 square, which would lead to mate. If we could do queen takes h2, that would lead to checkmate. But they have the key defender, which is the knight on f3, covering that square. So what we can do is, by taking the knight first with check, remember how we identify checks, always look for checks in puzzles, always. The knight takes f3 check leads to a forcing of one of three things. Whenever there's a check, there's three possible options that the other player has. They can either take the piece that's capturing, that's checking the king, or they can block the check, but if it's a knight check, you can't block that because the piece jumps over other pieces. Or you can move the king. So we'll consider the two cases where they either take the knight or move the king. Easy situation, knight takes f3, the only square the king can move is h1, and since they have no knight covering h2 anymore, queen h2 is just checkmate. If they take the knight with either the pawn or the queen, we have exactly the same thing. The h2 pawn is still undefended, so that will be the solution. Queen takes f3, and then queen takes h2 is checkmate. Okay, so now there's a lot more checks available in this puzzle, so we've got to consider our options more carefully. So we've got to look for the most forcing check that we can possibly find. So you could play something like rook f7 check maybe, but then the king can run to d6 and then suddenly start running across the board, king d6, they can just, they can run all the way around, and that's not what you want. Notice how we have a pawn on c6, which is, a pawn on b5, which is controlling the c6 square. And we have a rook controlling these three squares of the king. So to avoid the king running down to d6, we can play rook d5 check. Rook d5 then covers then we have all of these squares covered, which forces the king to c8. So that's forced. King c8 is forced. And then after that, we simply have a mate in one, which is rook e8. Checkmate. Another check. And that's the solution. Okay. So here, it looks like we are a piece up, actually. And we're in check. So now we have to look at our options, which is either moving the king or taking a piece, since we can't block it as it's a knight check. So if we move our king, it's looking a bit dangerous because they have threats of the rook coming to this file and potentially the queen getting around these dark squares, all of these dark squares which are quite vulnerable since we don't have any pawns covering these two squares. So we can consider a capture, for example. Queen takes e4. It looks crazy because we're sacrificing a queen for a knight. We are a piece up, so it would be two pieces for a knight. But the good news is after queen takes c4, queen takes e4, rook takes b8 is then just a free rook. And as well as that, after the king moves, we win the other rook. So we actually get a lot of material in exchange for the queen. So that is the solution here. Yep. Okay. So this is another endgame. So they've blocked our check with queen d6. And to simplify things, obviously we look at the check. Most obvious check, queen takes d6. If queen takes d6, he's obviously going to take it back, otherwise we're just a queen up. So king takes d6. And then we've got to calculate the race once again. And there's a box technique with the race, the pawn races usually, to check if the king can stop the pawn. So if on your move, say for example, if I played this move, we count 4 squares from the edge, right? There's 4. And then we create a box. So this is the box. If when we play this move, their king can enter any of the squares in this box, they can catch the pawn within this square. But if they can't, we're free to run. And in this case, if we take a4, the king can try and catch it. It won't be in time because it's not inside this box. It's on c5, just missing out. And then we can calculate whether or not this pawn is going to be faster than this pawn. And here, because the king will be blocking the pawn, and it's already our move first, we will definitely win the race. So queen takes, king takes. Here, here, here. King gets out the way, a2, d6, a1, queen. He gets to here, doesn't get a queen, and we just win the game basically. So that's the solution. Yep. Okay. So what's next? We have queen d3. So in this position, looks like relatively even material, except that we're down this pawn. That's the only thing that we're down in. But that is quite a powerful pawn. It's quite advanced and it's threatening to potentially one day become a queen. So, notice we look for checks as usual. So queen e2 is a check, which is defended by the rook. So queen e2 looks like nothing happens after queen e2 because they could even play something like knight f2 and just block everything really. There's no further checks unless you want to sacrifice the queen for no reason. They could even take, and then we take, and then knight f2. Doesn't seem to be anything there. But notice how the rook on c1 is undefended. So a capture. So we look at queen takes c1. And it looks like just a free rook. So we got to calculate, is there anything white can potentially do to attack us in this situation? Which there is. Queen takes c1, rook d7 looks like a threat coming in. But I think it's fine because we have 2 pieces on it. They also have 2 pieces on it. But we have a spare rook to double the defense just in case if we need to. So I believe that is the solution. And yeah, puzzle just ends after that. Yeah. Okay. Here. Okay. So when we're getting attacked, we've got to notice how much time we have to essentially do something to the other king. Because in this case, for example, white is threatening a checkmate in 1, queen f8. That's the issue we have right now. So we don't have much time to act, which means what we're going to have to look for is checks. Because a check forces their king to move. So the check that we have here is knight c2. You have knight f3 check as well. But then after knight f3, there's no really any further checks. Rook d1, but then king takes. If knight c2, and then the king has to move here, rook d1 then works and is checkmate because the king was forced to this square. Yeah, so this is making use of time effectively so that we don't get checkmated. We have to be efficient. So knight c2 is the solution. King here and rook checkmate because there's nothing that can block on this square. Okay. So knight e4. Okay. So we look for checks. In this case, I do not see any checks on the position. If we move the rook, there's no checks. Queen can come out, but again, no checks. Because the king's on a dark square and the queen, if we move on the diagonal, will still be in a light square, so it won't be check. So what we can do is then look for captures, as usual, right? So the only capture I see here is knight takes e4, which is the obvious move since they just moved a piece to try and exchange the knight. So if we do knight takes e4, and he takes, let's just say they've exchanged a piece for one of our pieces, so it looks like an even trade, right? But then we do have checks. In fact, we have a discovered check because we are then attacking the queen after the rook moves. So knight takes e4, rook takes e4. Pretend, okay, let's put that on the board because I'm sure that that's the first move. Okay, well in this case, because their rook f8 was the solution, they wanted to test us a bit harder. So knight takes e4. The solution would have been if rook takes e4, rook f8 check, forcing them to deal with that situation whilst leaving their queen on h5 undefended and attackable by our queen. And if they then, say for example, after rook takes e4, rook f8, the queen blocked it, we just win the queen. So the queen would have been lost in that situation. So here, instead of taking back the knight, they've moved the queen to avoid that happening to them, which is a smart decision. But the thing is, we're up a knight now. So what we can do is we can block the check by defending our knight and blocking the check at the same time. So the solution is going to be knight g3. Any other move we make, they can just take the knight, and probably our king is looking very weak relative to theirs. So we want to keep the knight and stay a piece up. So that's the solution. Okay, queen f3. Okay, now it looks pretty scary for white because our queen's on h2. It's very close to their king. The only thing is we're down the exchange. We're down. We've got a bishop for one of their rooks, and we have two other rooks as well. And also the last move that white just played is threatening to take our rook with check, and if they manage that successfully, I believe it's game over. So what we can do is, as usual, look for checks, and the only check I see is queen h1 check, which forces king to e2. Okay, and then we look for more checks. Maybe someone might think you could take on e1, maybe that's a check, right? But undefended, so that doesn't lead to anything. So the only other check after king e2 that I can see, apart from queen f1, which is obviously losing, is rook e8. Whilst getting out of this attack, we can check the king. So it seems like a quite a logical move. So queen h1, king e2, rook e8. After this, the king has multiple options. If it goes to d1, notice how our queen and the rook will be attacking their rook at the same time. And it's just a free rook because the king, if it's here, will block the defense of this rook by this rook. So king d1 in that position is not a good move for white. So after queen h1, king e2, rook e8, we've eliminated this option. Okay, what about king d2? Well, king d2 still defends this because they have the rook and the king. But what if we play bishop g5 check, another check, right? Then they can block with the queen or they can block with the rook potentially. If they block with the queen, we just take it with check, so we just win a queen, so that's clearly not the right move for white. If they move the rook to defend, we can also just take that with check, and we just win a rook for nothing. So that's clearly not the solution as well. So after queen h1, king e2, rook e8, king d2, bishop g5, the only other move that I can see that white could play is king c2. But then the king is no longer defending this rook, and we simply win the rook. And I believe that's the solution here. Queen h1, rook e8, king d2, bishop g5, king c2 exactly as we calculated, and then we just take the rook as such. And then they threw in a little check here, just in case someone might want to block or do something silly like this and lose a piece, but it's clearly just king h7, and that's fine. So that's the solution. Okay, great. Okay, so here I don't see any checks in this position. Right now we can only move 3 pieces, as it's an endgames are usually okay to calculate, but they require some interesting ideas, and since we have no checks, h4 is not check. If we move the rook, there's no check because this pawn's blocking anything, and obviously you can't check with the king. So what we can do is we can look for captures, and rook takes a4 is the only capture I see here, but clearly that doesn't work because their rook is defending that. But what we can do then is look to find ways to trap their king, since their king is a very vulnerable position right now. They only have one square to go to, and that's h4. And if you notice, our king is kind of blocking off their king. So even after h4, the only other move it would have after that, if it didn't want to go back to h5, is to go to h3, which means it's stuck on the h file as such. So what we can do is, if we can somehow get our rook to the back rank, or in this case the h file, we will win with checkmate. So the only way that I can see to do that, as we can't go down to try and do that, if we go up, we got to find the right square. And rook a6, if king moves, we don't have anything like rook h6, because the g6 pawn is defended by the h7 pawn, and it blocks access to the h6 square, so that clearly does not work. Rook a7, on the other hand, does have access to the h7 pawn, as that's the base of the pawn chain, and so it will be a checkmate. Rook a obviously does not work, because you can go here, but it's blocked by the pawn. It's just a bit too slow. So rook a7, and then we got to calculate, okay, well, what if he doesn't play this, and instead somehow finds a way to deal with this, right? For example, if he plays h6 after rook a7, h6, then it looks like, oh, okay, well here there's not really any direct check right now. But notice how if we do play rook h7, it's a pin, and the pin creates a problem for black because the h6 pawn will be frozen by the pin, and we also have the g5 pawn attacking the h6 square, meaning no matter what black does after that, we could play king h4, doesn't matter, we're going to have rook h6 on the next move. So rook a7 is a forced win. h6 as predicted, then rook h7, and there's no direct check with pawn takes g5. The one thing I didn't mention was, what can their black rook do? And they didn't have any direct way to defend the h7 pawn at that point, or the h6 pawn, because it was just too far away. It was just too far away. They can take here, but we would have had that checkmate regardless. And they're just playing a random check now. Sacrificing the rook doesn't lead to anything, because after takes, the a pawn wouldn't have been able to run fast enough, because we still would have had our rook. So either way, we were fine there. Okay, so the next puzzle, they've played rook c1. We have 3 minor pieces, and they have 2 minor pieces. And I believe they are, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so they've got a pawn for a piece, so we're up in material right now. And, okay, look for checks, as usual. Bishop takes f2, only check I see. Clearly doesn't do anything, because they just take, and doesn't really influence their position in any way. So it's not bishop takes f2. Then we look for captures, and the problem is we don't really have any captures. Literally no captures available. And we also have to watch out for our king, because our king is kind of close to their queen, and they have a pin going on over here, and a pawn which might start giving checks and threatening all sorts of things on the king side. They also have a bishop on c4, which might create problems on this diagonal if the king were to ever move here, meaning the g6 square wouldn't be protected. You know, we got to be careful, right? So what we can try and do is eliminate the threat of the queen. And notice how the queen right now is relatively low on squares, actually. So they can't go to g6 or h7. They can't go forward in any way along this entire diagonal. We've got a pawn defending that square, queen defending this square. Here, obviously, queen or rook defending that. If he tries to take the pawn, it's defended. Here, the pawn's attacking that square. Queen to g4, the knight is defending that square, even though it looks like we can't because the bishop will take our queen. If he does that, takes, and takes, we just win the bishop, and then we're 2 pieces up. Even though they can take our knight, then we'll be 1 piece up. Yeah, notice how our knight is under threat right now. So the only moves I can see that the queen has is f3 and h3. So we can consider both options. And how can we limit these options and attack the queen at the same time? Well, we can play knight d4. And this is like multi-purpose because knight d4 gets out of the threat of rook takes c2, attacks the queen, stops the queen from going to f3, and has the added potential threat of knight e2 check, creating a fork with the king and the rook. So if I just illustrate that. Here attacks both rook and king at the same time, in which case we could win an exchange. So after knight d4, queen's forced to move to h3. And that doesn't defend the e2 square, which means we get the fork in. So they have to either prioritize the rook or the queen, and most likely they'll prioritize the queen. And after queen h3, we'll be able to take the rook. So I believe that's the solution. Knight d4. They can take first. That's not a problem. Ah, okay, interesting. So after bishop takes g5, queen takes... bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. The queen then creates extra squares, which is quite interesting because they can go to queen h5, which defends the e2 square. But then the problem they're going to have is that we have rook h8, essentially deflecting the queen from defending the e2 square. They could also play queen g4 check, but then we have queen g6 coming. And because we're already a piece up, if we just exchange everything, we're going to win the game. We're already a piece up. So queen takes f6, obvious, and they're just exchanging queens because it's pretty simple from this position. Okay, rook takes a6. Okay, it looks like another endgame. Okay, so checks. Only check rook b3, which is just sacrificing a rook for nothing, it looks like, because maybe this pawn can run, but after rook takes, bishop takes, bishop covers the d1 square, and then there's nothing. So what we can do is look for captures, and that check was a capture, but clearly it doesn't work. So another capture that we have is rook takes bishop instead, potentially blocking the threat of them defending the pawn from running. So say for example they take, pawn takes, and then we run. And how can they stop the pawn? They can't, because the king won't be inside the box, one square around the pawn. Remember the box technique that I taught. So rook takes here, here. If they cannot get into this box on the next move, they will not be able to catch the pawn, and the king is just one square away. So here it works. Rook takes e4, and then run, and queen. So there we go. Okay, next one. Knight takes g4. Knight takes g4. So we look for checks as usual, and here we actually have a nice capture with a check, which is bishop takes g4. That's the first move that came into my mind. Bishop takes g4 also attacks the queen and creates a check, and that just looks like the solution, I believe. After bishop takes g4, if they play king g1, we may have to be a bit careful of bishop takes d5 coming, because if we move the king, actually, you know what, it's fine. I was worried about rook takes f8 after bishop takes d5, because the king wouldn't be defending the rook anymore, but we have the queen, so it's no problem. And yeah, so the first check I noticed was this, and I believe it works. If we play something like queen h4, they have g3, and the problem is we can't take on h2 because the knight is defending the pawn on h2. So bishop takes g4 seems to work. I believe that's it. Bishop takes g4, we take a knight also. We are still down a piece, I believe. Yeah, because they have an extra bishop. But we can just take the queen, I think. Yeah. And then, yep, bishop d5, and it's no problem because king h8. And there we go. Okay, this is a very interesting endgame. So this is going to be another race, but instead of racing the pawns initially, it's going to be a race to see who can capture all the pawns, all the important pawns first, and then run. So we're going to calculate captures. There's no checks here. Captures, captures. That's the base for what we have here. So the king is on h4 and the king's here, and it's our move. So takes, king to f3. If the king tries to come round and defend, I believe, because of our king is pushing them at least one square away from our king, they will not be able to defend. For example, here, king f3, king g5, king e4, king f6, king d5, king e7, king c6, and they're not in time to defend the b6 pawn. So what they've got to do is they got to go for the base of our pawn chain, which is c2. And if they do that, we've got to calculate. So these are the two bases. We've got to calculate who gets there first. So pawn takes, king f3. So they're going to have to try and go for the c2 pawn. So let's say they play king h3 because they can't come in yet. King e4, king g2, king d5, king f2, king c6, king e2, takes, king d2. And because our a4 pawn is furthest advanced, we want to take this one next. They take our pawn. We go back to b6 to allow the pawn to run. They will probably take the d3 pawn because their d pawn is the furthest advanced. So d3, a5, their king gets out the way. a6, d3, a7, d2, a8, and we win the race. They also get a queen. So what we've got right now is their king here and their queen here, our queen here, and our king here. And what we can try and do is we can check and then try and exchange the queens. And because they have this pawn left and we have this pawn left, the b3 and c5, since their king's too far away from our pawn but ours is still next to theirs, if we exchange queens, we should win that endgame. So I believe we just take, king f3. He's going to try and run round. We keep going. Takes. King takes a5, and then we run. Oh, I guess it wasn't right. So what do we have? King takes c5. Actually, I don't know if you can see that small... we'll look at it after. I'll come back to it after. Actually, it was king takes c5 because after king takes c2, we can take the pawn on d4. You can go back in the video and have a look at the position, but after king takes c5, we can win the d4 pawn instead, which is cleaner. But I do believe both ways win in the end, but their solution is probably quicker actually. Okay, what's next? Queen g3. Okay. Queen g3, so we look for checks. Queen e6. That's the first check that I see, which forces king h8 because they can't go to here because of our rook. So queen e6, king h8. And then what moves do we have available? We have more checks available. So we could play like rook f8 check maybe. But the problem is they can just take, and then they're threatening checkmate on our back rank, so that's probably not a good idea. So after queen e6, king h8, we've got to look for a way to try and trap their king, or maybe win a piece. I mean, we're down a bishop right now. So after queen e6, king h8, maybe something like queen f7, attacking the rook, and if the rook moves, we can take the bishop and then threaten rook f8 checkmate afterwards. I believe because queen e6 is the only viable check here, anything else we do will be too slow. So I'll put that on the board. Queen e6, king h8. Okay. So now, let's see if we can find a way to break the position open. We don't have queen e5 because their queen's covering that square. If we play rook f7, they have queen e1, and then that's going to lead to checkmate after knight d1 takes. So we can't move the rook up without checking. So I believe queen f7 is the only thing I see here. Which looks threatening, because we're threatening to take the rook, and if the rook moves, we take the bishop. Maybe knight d5 as well, because the bishop can't move, because then we take the rook. If we play queen f7, I'm wondering if queen b8 to defend the rook, what is our next move? And I don't see it. I don't see a valid move after that, because this all defended. And we don't have any checks because the bishop and the rook and then also the queen will be covering that square. And it looks like we have a checkmate on g7, but we don't because they have a knight on h5 covering that square. So queen s7, queen b8, I don't see anything. So queen s7 doesn't look right. What about queen d7? Well, then we might have the same problem, which is queen b8. And then everything's defended. So it looks like knight d5, potentially winning this piece, is the solution. I'm thinking if they play queen d6 to defend that, then do we have anything to win the piece? If knight d5, queen d6, our queen is now undefended, so we might have to take knight d5, queen d6, queen takes d6, bishop takes d6, and then I don't see a move. So I'm not sure if it is knight d5. Okay. Knight d5, queen d6. There might be a move. There might maybe rook f8 check, but then rook takes, and then we don't have anything. It's interesting. Maybe even like knight takes e4 could be a move. Knight takes e4, threatening knight d6, but doesn't threaten it because queen takes. Okay. We gotta find a move. The problem is this queen is covering the diagonal. This square is kind of important to give a check. So, knight d5, queen d6. Maybe then we play queen f7. That could be the solution. Knight d5, queen d6, queen f7, threatening the rook. And now because we have the knight defending here, if the queen goes here, then we take the bishop. If knight d5, queen d6, queen f7, queen d7, then defending everything. What will happen in the end is we'll take the bishop, and if he takes with the rook, we have checkmate. And if not, queen d7, knight takes e7. If he takes with the queen, we can take the queen, and after rook takes, then we have rook f8 checkmate. So I believe that's the solution. Oh, okay, I was wrong. It might have been queen f7 first. Oh, yeah. It might have been queen f7 first. Queen f7 first, queen b8, and then maybe knight d5. That might have been the solution. But we'll, again, the ones I don't get right, which is we've got the last two wrong, we'll go back on afterwards and I'll show you. Okay, knight takes e4. Okay. So first thing I notice is we have a check and a capture. Which seems like it's just going to be checkmate. I'm not sure this is a trick puzzle, but queen takes a1. If they block it with the queen, we just take a free queen. And then after the king moves, just queen g1, I believe it's just checkmate. So, yeah. Okay. And then this is checkmate. Okay, a very, very simple one there. Okay. So this next puzzle, bishop a6. Okay. Well, a common thing here is potentially delaying a check to win a piece. It's a very common theme. I've seen a lot of positions like this where you can play queen a4 check, hitting the king and the piece at the same time. But I believe we're supposed to take the bishop first, knight takes, and then queen a4, because then the knight's not possible to defend. If queen a4 first, queen d7, and if we take the bishop, he can take our queen first, eliminating the defender of the bishop, and then it's not going to work out, so we have to take the bishop first. Queen a4 check, knight d7, and then we take the knight. Okay. Rook e8. Okay. So again, we look for checks. I don't see any valid checks happening here. Queen e7, queen e8, queen e6 don't look good because we're already down in exchange. Knight for a rook. So the only move I see that looks like a good check is rook takes h7. So, after rook takes h7, if king takes f6, which is one of the possible moves, this rook is not defended by the king anymore. So we can just take the rook. I believe we should be fine then, because some queen checks we just go to a2 and there's no more checks after that, so we'll just be a knight up. After rook takes h7, if they block, we just take with check, and then we hit the queen, so that clearly doesn't work because they're just sacrificing extra material for no reason. If they play king g8, we can consider that actually. Rook h7, king g8. Looks like f7 then wins, because instead of taking the rook this time and letting them capture our rook, we check, make them take, and we take the rook and make another queen at the same time, which looks very powerful. So king g8 doesn't work. So the only move left to consider is king f8. And I believe after king f8, we've got to find a way to potentially get this pawn and make it a very valuable asset. So rook h7, king f8. The first check that I see in that position is rook h8 check. And if the king moves back, we have queen takes e8, winning a rook. If rook g8, that's the one we have to consider. We've got to find a way to kill the king, essentially. And then we might have queen h6, I believe. And then after king f7, rook h7 will lead to checkmate, I believe. So I think that's the solution. Okay, well, they're not playing it out, but this is winning. Rook takes g7, check, queen takes, and then our interesting in-betweener here, instead of taking it back and letting them take us, we take the rook with check, king takes, and then we're just up a knight. So we do that. Okay, rook takes a2. So here, we actually have some discovered checks. So obviously look for checks first. The knight can go to e2 or h3, and those are the only checks we have. So if we go to e2, it looks like we just take the queen afterwards, right? But after knight takes e2, knight takes e2, the knight covers the queen, so it doesn't work. Knight takes e2, clearly it doesn't work then. So consider knight takes h3. If he takes, that's no problem because we win the queen. If he moves the king or anywhere, we just take the queen. So I believe that's the solution. Just a discovered check, winning the it's a discovered attack by a check. Yeah, so that's the solution. And takes. There we go. Okay. Bishop c7. Bishop c7. Okay, well, we look for checks again. We also got to be careful because they're threatening queen h2 or some combination of rook d1 and queen h2 coming to checkmate us at the back rank. So we might have to act pretty fast, is what I'm thinking. So what I saw was rook d8 is a check, but after after bishop takes d8, which is forced, we have queen b7, which is just checkmate. And I think that's the solution because it's defended by the bishop. So rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, queen b7 is immediately working. I mean, initially I looked at sacrificing the bishop, king takes, and then taking the rook, simply winning a rook, but then maybe the queen can come and chase our king for a little bit, but I think it probably still wins anyway. But rook takes d8 is a forcing move. Remember, we want to look at forcing moves first. So rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, queen b7, wins. Okay. Queen d4. Okay. So we're in check. We have 2 bishops for a rook and a whole bunch of extra pawns. 1, 2, 3. So we are upper material. And the only worry that we have is our king's safety, which is a bit dodgy because it's in the middle of the board right now. So we have 2 possible options of moving the king. And we can't capture the queen. We can block, but we just lose the queen because covered by both the queen and their rook. So king e2 or king c1. Those are 2 options. Okay. If king e2, they have rook e3 check and maybe queen e3 check. because we're attacking their rook. So king e2, queen e3 doesn't seem like much of a threat because after king d1, looks like our king can just keep running away, and if they go back to d4 we can just repeat. And I mean, I think we're supposed to win this game, but after queen e3, king d1, if they go back, we repeat the cycle, and because it's a puzzle, we're looking for a way to win. So I don't think king e2 is the right thing. Okay, if they play queen e3, but if they don't play queen e3, we can consider rook e3, in which case we can play king f1 or king f2. If we play king f2, the problem is the queen has the potential to check us after moving the rook, which is on e3. So they could play rook c3 check, for example, and then they will win our queen. So king e2, rook e3, king f2, rook c3 is a check and attacking the queen, and we'll lose the queen. So that's not a good move. So after king e2, rook e3, king f2 loses. So king f1, we can consider king f1. And I don't see any, because the queen can't go to hit c4 to check us, or d3, because then we just exchange. I don't see any way for black to do anything there. King e2, rook e3, not king f2, yeah. King e2, rook e3, king f1. Maybe the only check they have is rook f3 again, but then we go back. Or we go to g2. In fact, yeah, if they go rook f3, when the king's on f1, we go back to g2. And then there's no issue because the rook's undefended and the bishop's covering this square. Queen's also covering this whole row. And I think the king will be safe from that point. So I don't think rook f3 after king f1 works. So king e2, rook e3, king f1. We've got to consider any other possible moves black might have. For example, queen f6, check. After king g2, then they might have queen f3, which looks a bit dangerous. So I'm wondering, instead of playing king g2, maybe then we just play bishop f2, because it's defended by a queen, and then I think they have no attack. So I believe that looks like the right solution, but I'm not sure. So that looks like a potential right solution, but we should check the other option as well. So king c1, what can they play after king c1? Well, the first thing I see that they can do is a check, queen a1, and if we repeat, that's clearly not the solution, because then they can go back to d4 and they repeat as well. King c1, queen a1. The only other move then we have is queen b1, and what can we do in that case? Queen b1, then they have queen a3 check, and then the d3 square becomes weak and it looks pretty dangerous, and I think we're going to get mated somehow. So I don't think that's the solution. So I think king e2 is the right move. Yes, and it is. And they play queen e3, forcing this, and that's the solution. Yep, okay. Alright, moving on. Okay, so we have bishop h4. Bishop h4. Interesting. Okay, so we look for checks, as usual. And actually, I think this one's a pretty easy solution, but it's a bit difficult to see because you have to consider lateral movement as well. A lot of people don't tend to look at horizontal movement and rather just think keep going forwards. So the first check I saw was queen d3, and the king can't move to h8 because of the bishop, can't take the bishop because of the knight, can't go to g6 because of the queen. So the only move they have is f5. But then after en passant, which is a little move, but I'm not going to explain that here, pawn takes that, and then they still can't move, and I believe that's just checkmate. So queen d3 and takes. It's just checkmate, yeah. Okay, nice. Bishop d1. Okay, so it looks like a free bishop. They are up a bishop. But we look for checks first. Bishop d5, most obvious check. So after bishop d5, we're also then skewering the rook. So after bishop d5, let's say they play king b6. Then the king is actually quite low on squares. So I'm thinking, is there a way to checkmate the king there, maybe? With something like queen e6, king a7. Doesn't seem like there's a direct way to do it. Also have to notice that our rook is hanging right now, which is a problem, which means we're going to have to find a way to keep checking or win a lot of material very fast. Otherwise, this pawn's going to eventually run after this bishop moves and the rook is going to be taken. And I think bishop d5 is the only logical check I can see here. I don't see any other move. Like queen f3, they just take it. Bishop c8, they can just take it. And then after like queen d5, king can run, I don't know, a7 maybe. And the problem is their queen also defends the a3 pawn. Otherwise, we would have some sort of tactic where rook takes a3. So I don't see any other move that can possibly be played in the beginning, apart from bishop d5. So let's put down the board. Bishop d5. Okay, king a7. Okay. So, this is a nice one actually. So this is another, I don't know if you remember the puzzle that we did earlier, which was, it was about taking on h2. I can't remember which one it was. It's quite one of the earlier ones, I think. Oh, it was this one. It was the puzzle rated 822, if you want to look back at that puzzle, where we distracted the knight defending the h2 pawn. This is a similar idea. So in this case, we want to take on c7, because then after king a6, queen b7 is checkmate, defended by the bishop. King can't go to a5 because the pawn b6, b7, and a7 covered by the queen. So we've got to redirect this piece and force a checkmate. And it's interesting because it also looks like we want to get our rook to a3. And that might lead to checkmate if they went king b8 and then rook takes a8, defended by the bishop, is also checkmate. So we're going to see which misdirection do we kind of want to happen. So we could either take this first or take this first. If we took this first to try and get the rook to checkmate, queen takes c7, rook takes a3, it doesn't quite work because they have bishop a4 blocking the check. So that doesn't work, unfortunately. But what we can do is play rook takes a3 first, avoiding bishop a4. I mean, if they play bishop a4, then we can just take the queen, which is probably the line we're going to have to calculate, because then they also get another queen back, but their king's in danger. So it looks like rook takes a3 is the initial move. And if the queen takes, we see that this is going to lead to checkmate, as we saw before. So bishop a4, we've got to calculate. Rook takes c3. And we're up a queen. But they queen with check. So we're going to have to play king g2. It's forced. And we're going to look to see if they have any checks coming along. Because if they don't, our rook and our queen are converging on the c7 bishop, and it's going to lead to checkmate somehow, or winning a piece or a rook or something, and we're attacking their rook as well. So after rook takes a3, bishop a4, rook takes e3, queen, king g2. The only check I see for them is queen takes d5, but I just sacrifice the queen and then they'll lose the game. Queen to f3, we just take. And then queen f1, queen g1, queen h1, they're just useless checks, right? So I believe that's the solution. Rook takes a3, bishop a4, and take the queen. Queen, king g2, and then they sacrifice the queen like I said, and they just lose. Okay, nice. Okay, so now we've got queen c1 check. Okay, so that's quite a forcing move. So we've got to consider the options. So we have king takes the bishop is the most obvious option, you know, capturing a piece and getting out of the check. We also have king c3. And those are the only two options we have. So let's consider taking the bishop first. King takes a2. What kind of attack do they have? All the pieces that they have is the queen and the rook. So we've got to consider the combinations that these can create threats on with the king. So king takes a2. Queen b1 is the only check I see, because a1's covered by our queen. King a2, queen b1. Then king a3 is forced. Then they can play queen a1, but that just loses because a1's covered by the queen, and if rook takes, then our other rook can take that back. So after king takes a2, after queen b1, king a3, I don't see any other checks. Yeah, I don't see any other checks. So what might happen is they might just take our rook and be happy with that. Okay, I'm up in material. Because they will then have a rook for a bishop. But we also have a counterattack coming of queen d8 check, forcing king h7 and e5, unleashing the bishop. And then they have to block, and then the f7 pawn is vulnerable, and then we can take advantage of that by playing like queen f8, and this pawn's not defendable, I believe. So that seems to work. If king c3, let's consider if there's any other potential dangers. Well, if king c3, actually, the bishop will be defending the f7 pawn in that potential variation where we attack, so that probably isn't the right move. Because they can then probably just take the rook and get away with their king being safe by this bishop. So king takes a2 is probably the right move, as it is, and they take. Okay. So now we have to time this correctly, because if we play e5 first to threaten checkmate, they can play queen b1, forcing king a3, and then queen a1 check, forcing an exchange of queens, and then they're just out material and they'll win the game. So we don't want that. So queen d8 is forced. King h7 is also forced. Okay, and e5 is the only check, and it's the only move that makes sense, and I believe that's the right move. Yep, g6. Okay. So now we've got to stop them from defending the f7 pawn, and create an attack. So there's many ways to attack this. We could even take here, attack that, queen f8. But the one I'm looking at is queen f6, because otherwise they have queen f4, which can create some problems defending. Yeah, so queen f6 looks pretty strong. So then we've got to look out for any checks. So queen f6, maybe queen a1 is coming. King b3, rook b1 check, king c4. It's looking pretty dangerous. We might be out of time actually because of these checks coming in, and then they're gonna have pawn checks coming in and the queen. So we might not have time. What we might have to do is we might have to go for a draw in this position. So bishop takes g6, for example. If bishop takes g6, I'm not sure, but I think we might be able to find a draw. King takes g6, queen f6. If he goes back, then we can keep checking. Queen f7, king h8, and then just keep going back and forth. So after bishop takes, queen f6, king h5, there's actually g4 checkmate, so that's clearly not going to work. So I think this, after bishop takes g6, he's got to take with a pawn if he wants to avoid that. But then we also then just have this repetition of queen bouncing between these two squares, and it'll be a draw. Otherwise we're going to get checkmated, it looks like. So I believe that's the solution, and it is. Yeah, because we were out of time, because the queen a1 and rook b1 checks were incoming and they were going to be too fast. Okay, so next puzzle, rook takes c2. What have they taken? A knight. Okay, so we're down a knight in this position for a pawn. Okay, what do we have in this position? So, okay, checks. We have queen f7 check, forcing king takes f7. But after that, they just have these two defended pieces, and there's nothing we can do to really break that, except maybe king takes, rook takes a4. And then we're just up a pawn, which is, I mean, we have a good chance to win the game, maybe, but then rook takes f2, and then they're gonna line up on the second rank and become very dangerous. So that probably isn't the solution we're looking for, especially in Puzzle Rush. Okay. Do we have any other checks? Rook d8 is another check. Rook d8 could be interesting because it's misdirecting this rook from defending this rook. So rook d8 check, rook takes is forced. And then maybe we can take this rook or something. But the thing is, I don't see it, because if we then take this rook, he can exchange queens and then run the knight away, and then all we're down is we're just down a knight, and it doesn't look right. So I'm not sure if either of those are the solutions. So there might be another move potentially. What about captures? Queen takes c2. Rook takes c2. Ah, yes, I think that's the solution. Queen takes c2. If they take the queen back, we have the in-betweener move. We don't have to take that rook back straight away. Rook d8 then forces them to sacrifice their queen. Queen f8. And then we give another in-betweener move with check. King takes, and then we take the rook back. And then we're up a rook for a knight. That's how we win the game. If queen takes c2, if they don't take, I don't see any other candidate moves for them, because then we just win the rook for nothing. So I believe that's the solution. Queen takes, rook d8, check, in-betweener, another in-betweener, and then take the rook. Okay. Good. Okay. Queen d3. We're on 35. That's pretty good. Queen d3. Okay, well, there's a lot of big pieces in this puzzle. We've got queen and both rooks, all the major pieces. So what I'm thinking is look for checks as usual. Queen takes d3, first check available, and then king takes d3. But the problem is everything's defended. I don't see any way to win here, because queen takes d3, king takes. Maybe we have a check like c4. And obviously you can't take with a pawn because double rook attacking here. King takes c4. And then, yeah, I think they're fine, because we don't really have any further checks in those variations. I don't see anything. So I don't think queen d3 is correct. Unless queen d3, king d3, maybe a capture first or something. I don't see anything there. So I don't think that's right. And the other check like here is you just lose a queen, so it's not right. Okay, so captures. Rook takes a4 is an interesting move. So right now we're actually attacking this one 3 times. This square 3 times. Queen and 2 rooks. And they only have 2 defenders. But their queen is attacking ours. So if we take, we've got to calculate the line where they take this. We get 2 rooks for a queen, but I don't think that's winning, because king c3, and then the queen's going to get in behind here, and then maybe the d6 pawn will become weak, or there's checks, maybe there's some repetitions going to happen with checks here. So rook takes a4, queen takes b5, rook takes a2. I'm not sure if there's anything there. So what we can consider is maybe another capture. Queen takes a4, but then we just lose the queen, so that does not work. What other moves do we have? Candidate moves. Rook takes a4. I mean, queen takes b5. I just don't see a solution to that. After rook takes, king c3. Maybe bring the rook up. Yeah, no, but then the queen's gonna come in behind. It's not gonna work. So, okay. What about c4? If he takes the rook, we just take their rook, so that doesn't work. Queen, pawn takes, will lead to rook takes a4. If they take our queen, we give a check, and if they come up, we give another check, and then take the queen. So, after c4, pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes, king has to go back somewhere. Maybe king d1. Rook check. Bring the other rook yeah, in that case, what's gonna happen is they're gonna lose the queen because we're gonna have two rooks here, eventually creating a skewer or a pin, in which case we get the queen for one of the rooks and we will win that endgame. So we can consider queen takes now. If queen takes e4, pawn takes e4 will mean we just win a rook. So if queen takes, if a rook takes, we take the rook and we just win a rook. So c4, queen takes c4. After queen takes e4, that's, I think every single possible way of taking is loses for them. So I believe c4 is the solution. Yeah. Okay. Queen takes c4. So we calculate queen takes e4. Rook takes loses that rook. Pawn takes loses that rook. So yeah. And there we go. That's it. Okay, cool. Rook takes f7. Okay. Okay, so here it's not looking good for us necessarily because we're down a rook right now, although we can take the rook, which could be a candidate move actually, because then next move we're threatening queen h6 checkmate or queen g8 checkmate. So okay, well, let's look at checks first. Queen h6, queen h5, queen h4. Queen h4 loses because queen takes, king takes, and then the rook can move, and then they're just a rook up, so that doesn't work. Queen h5 check. Okay. Queen h5 check, rook h7. And then we're pinned, and we just lose the queen. So I don't think that works. And the same thing, queen h6, rook h7, pinned, and we lose the queen. So none of the queen checks here are going to work. Queen d8 check, maybe. After king g7, we can come back, I guess. And that might lead to a draw, because we can just keep going back and forth. But I think we might be able to win this position. So I don't think queen d8 is right. So, okay. Let's think. There's no other checks. Bishop takes f7. Bishop takes f7. What does black have? Does black have any checks? I don't think black has any other checks. There's no queen g4 because the pawn, the queen can't go anywhere else. Queen can't go down here. Knight f1 doesn't do anything. So after here, how are they stopping queen g8? I'm not sure. I don't see how. Queen f4 doesn't stop it. I might be missing a move because it seems relatively easy. Maybe queen d1? No, they're too slow there. Bishop takes f7, simply threatening queen g8. Okay, let's just look at all the queen moves. f4. After bishop takes f7, queen f4. We have checkmate on g8. So that doesn't work. Queen h4, we just take. Queen g4, we just take. There's no knight checks. And if the king moves, then we have queen g6 check, and then king here, and then that's going to be mate, so the king can't move. So I think it's bishop takes f7. I don't see anything else really. Yeah, and that's it. Okay, cool. Rook g6. Okay, so here we are even in material, I think. Yeah, even material. 2 knights for a knight and a bishop. And okay, maybe we're up 1 pawn, but it's a very open, crazy game with lots of pieces everywhere, so I'm not sure that matters too much. And they've just played rook g6, so our queen's under threat. But our queen's in a very attacking position over here. So let's look for checks. Queen h7 was the first thing I looked at, but knight takes h7, and then yeah, we just lose the queen, so that doesn't work. Queen h8, lose the queen. Queen g7, queen f8, all lose the queen. There's no knight checks. We do have bishop b3 check, actually, which is a potential good move. But the only thing I'm thinking is they could just block it with something like e6 or d5 maybe. Because the knight's defending there. So I don't think that's right. So what other moves do we have? There's no checks that seem to work anyway. Captures. Okay, let's look at captures. Well, queen takes g6 looks like nothing's gonna happen really. Because after knight takes, maybe bishop b3, but then d5, and then it's not looking good. If rook takes e5, rook takes h6, bishop b3 maybe, e6, I don't see anything. Maybe knight takes e6, pawn takes, bishop takes, but we just sacrifice way too many pieces there, and I don't think that works. Maybe, since our queen is trapped, this might be a puzzle where we just need to get out unscathed with our queen. So there might be a way to get our knight out doing something and get the queen to safety at the same time. So maybe something like this. Knight e6. If knight e6, we're threatening their queen. So if they take our queen, we take their queen, and then since the queen was defending e5, we can then take it with a rook afterwards. So this knight won't just lose, it just won't just go for anything. So knight e6, pawn takes e6, which is what we've got to consider now. And then we've got to get the queen out, right? So maybe queen f4. Maybe queen f4. But the problem is it's not a pin because the rook's defending the queen. Knight e6, pawn takes e6. And then I don't see how we can defend, or we can win back the piece that we just sacrificed. Knight takes e6, pawn takes, queen f4. Maybe it's queen e3 even. Forcing this knight to move and then taking e6 with check. But I don't know if that's right. Knight to e6. Pawn to e6. Is there a solution here? If there is, I'm not seeing it. Knight e6, pawn e6, queen f4. If the knight moves, let's say to f7 or something, queen takes, the rook can take the queen back so it doesn't win there. Maybe bishop e3. It might be bishop b3 first and then knight e6. Winning back like an extra pawn or something. Bishop b3, e6. Knight takes. And then if pawn takes, queen f4. Doesn't seem to work. This is a tough one. Okay, well, we're going to lose this queen if we don't do anything about it. And bishop b3 doesn't seem to do anything. I mean, after e6, we might have knight takes e6. Oh! It might be bishop e3, e6, knight takes e6. Because if takes, then we do the same idea we had earlier with knight e6. After takes, rook takes e5, and then we're just better. Bishop e3, e6, knight takes e6. If he takes back, then we can take that with check. And then they might have to play knight f7, in which case they give up the rook. Since the bishop on e6 and the queen on h6 control all of the squares surrounding the king, they have to block it. Which means they either have to give up the queen or play knight f7, which gives up the rook. So I think that's the right solution. Bishop e3 if e6. Bishop e3, if d5, we have knight e6 anyway. And that's just free because they can't even take it. They'll have to take the queen and trade. So I think that's right. Bishop e3, e6, exactly. Knight takes e6. Rook takes h6. And now we take with check. And that's it, yep. Okay, bishop b4. Okay, so even-ish material. So we've got a knight for a bishop, and we are down 2 pawns overall. Yeah. And we've got a very nasty pin to deal with because the bishop and knight are looking to eat us alive, basically. And if you play rook d3 to defend, which is clearly not the solution to this, even bishop e4 is going to cause another pin and ridiculous problems that we don't know how to deal with. So we're going to look for attacking moves, and the first attacking move I see is rook g7 with check defended. And he can't play king f8 because of the knight, so king h8 is forced. Then we've got to find a way to not get checked a lot of times and then lose all the pieces on the queen side. So queen g7, king h8. If we do a random check, just random check like rook g4 to try and win this bishop, they can just take the bishop because that was the piece attacking the check and they just eliminated it, and then we don't win anything. So rook takes f7, for example, again another check. They can just take, or they can just take with the rook, even attacking our king. So rook g7, king h8. We have to find a way to make it a more of a devastating threat. So what I was thinking was another check. Rook takes h7, double check, forcing the king to take the rook. Then maybe knight f6 check. And then if the king goes back on that diagonal on one of these two squares, we're going to have more threats coming. The problem is they can eliminate this bishop every time. Maybe it's not rook g7 first. Maybe it's something like knight f8. Oh, sorry, knight f6 first. And then after the king moves, we can take on d5, defending the bishop. And after they take, then we play rook d3 defending. It might just be one of those puzzles where we have to survive. Rook g7, king h8, I don't see a way to survive, because I think we just end up losing the bishop, and then we're just too far down in material. Rook g7, king h8, I don't see a way, because after rook takes, king takes, knight f6, king h6 even, there's nothing. Knight g4, king h5, it can just run to h4 and it'll be fine. So rook takes here, here. Any rook move that's not here, they take the bishop and then they just win the game. So I think it's knight f6, and no matter where they go, we can take the bishop on d5 and then play rook d3 defending. I think that's right, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's wrong, because this looks very dangerous. So let's try it. Okay, it's not right. Okay, good. Well, 38, that's not a bad score. We'll take that. As you can see, all time 6, so not the best, but we'll take it. And anyway, let's have a look at the other puzzles that didn't get right. Starting with this one, where we got this far, and then I chose to take on a5, but the right solution is taking on c5, because you can take the d4 pawn straight away, and as you'll see, after king c2, king d4, then we start another race where they take here, king c5, and then the d pawn runs faster than the a pawn. If we took on a5, I think I calculated it as a win still, but it would have been very close, because you might not have been able to force a queen trade at the end, which is what we discussed, I believe. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So queen g3, queen e6 check. We got queen e6 check, king h8, and then we played knight d5, and we were talking about queen f7 and queen d7. I think the right solution might have been queen f7 first and then knight d5, but let's have a look what they did. Queen takes e7. Ah, yes. There you go. I didn't even consider that capture. See, always think about checks and captures first. There were no checks that worked. I just tried to look for ways to develop the pin, which clearly didn't work. Queen e7 is very, very good move. Rook takes leads to checkmate. And if you don't take, I'm going to play rook f8 anyway, probably. So yeah, that's nice. Okay, and then the third one. Let's see. The one we were just discussing, bishop b4. So it is rook g7, king h8. And I wasn't sure if rook h7 worked. Rook g8. Ah. Oh, that's very nice, yeah. Making use of the fact that we have the other rook on d1. King g8. And then the next move is going to be rook g1, I'm assuming. Because that's just going to be checkmate. After bishop d2, rook g2. It's going to be checkmate, yeah. Very nice. Okay, very nice. I hope that's been relatively instructive. It's required quite a lot of thought from me. So, yeah. I'll see you in the next video.